Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another webinar in our UGLE lecture series. My name is Sean Butler, and I am the Communications Manager at UGLE, and I am delighted that you could join us tonight for what I'm sure is going to be a fascinating and engaging look at one of our nation's greatest heroes. Now, before I introduce our guest speaker this evening, I'd like to let you know that there will be a Q&A session shortly after the presentation, so please do submit your questions throughout, and you can do that just under where you're seeing me now. You can do that just underneath in a little question box there. And as I said, Malcolm has very kindly agreed to take some questions on the topic afterwards, so I'll put those to Malcolm once the presentation has finished. So without further ado, our speaker this evening is Malcolm Brooks. Malcolm was born in Sheerness in Kent in June of 1945, and from 1963 to 1985, served in the Royal Navy as a weapons electrical artificer. Malcolm is a freeman of the City of London and a liveryman of the Worshipful Company of Loriners. As you can probably tell from the topic of tonight's talk, Malcolm's hobbies generally centre around naval history. In terms of Freemasonry, Malcolm was initiated into United Service Lodge number 3124 in September of 1973 and served as the lodge's worshipful master from 1986 to 1987, and in the centenary year of 2004 to 2005. In Grand Lodge, Malcolm holds the role of Grand Tyler, a role that he's held since 2008, and in 2015 was appointed past junior Grand Deacon. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Malcolm Brooks for another edition in our UGLE webinar series, Was Nelson a Freemason? And I hope you will enjoy.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I understand we've got a few people watching tonight, and I hope you all three enjoy the following half hour or so. In addressing the question of whether Nelson was a Freemason, I would like to briefly run over his career, because during his career, he did meet some eminent Freemasons. Nelson was born in Burnham Thorpe in Norfolk, the son of the local rector, and he left Norwich area in 1770 in order to join his uncle's ship, the Raisonnable, which at that time was laying in Chatham. Raisonnable had been called to the colours because there was a threat of war with Spain, and Nelson had written off to his uncle, Maurice Suckling, to ask if he had a place for him. And Maurice Suckling was his wife's brother, and asked what the devil Nelson had done wrong to clue up with a job in the Navy, a career in the Navy. Nevertheless, he took him on board, and the threat of war went away. And so rather than leave Nelson as a 12-year-old boy stomping up and down doing absolutely nothing, Maurice Suckling arranged for him to be transferred to a merchant ship belonging to a friend of his, and he went to America on the North Sea, on the Northern Atlantic trade for 18 months in a ship. And when he returned, he joined his uncle Maurice again, based at Sheerness, just down the road from here. And he spent the next 18 months or so acting as a boat's coxswain in and out of the Thames estuary. It helped him greatly in terms of his ability to be a seaman, boat handling, all that sort of thing, navigation, pilotage, everything that a young lad needed to know, in effect. So that's what he did until February 73. And then an opportunity came. A bomb ketch called the Carcass was going up to the Arctic with another ship called the Racehorse. And they were on expedition to try and discover the Northwest Passage, which they'd been looking for centuries, the way through to China. Of course, that didn't open up until about 10 years ago, when the global warming allowed ships to traverse that bit. But they went in search of it in the Arctic, and Nelson went along. Even though he was only 15 years of age, he was a competent boat handler, as I've said, and so therefore he was taken on as the coxswain of Captain Luttridge's ship, and went up to the Arctic for 9 months, in fact, in the cold. He learned a great deal up there, and when he came back, he was very, very experienced. one of the next jobs he did, he became a midshipman as soon as he left Carcass, and he was sent to HMS Seahorse and sent out to the Far East. And while in the Far East, where he spent nearly 3 happy years, he contracted, towards the end of his time out there in Trincomalee, he contracted malaria and was extremely ill. So ill, in fact, that it was determined that he would be repatriated to this country because he wasn't going to get better in the tropics. And he came back into this country on board HMS Dolphin, a supercargo, in 1776, and was then allowed to recuperate. He joined HMS Worcester in October 76 as a 4th lieutenant. So it was a step towards promotion as far as he was concerned, an acting 4th lieutenant, a step up from midshipman, but no longer, or not yet, a qualified lieutenant. And it wasn't until later in that year that he actually took his lieutenant's examination. Now, I've already mentioned Captain Maurice Suckling, who was his uncle. And by this time, Captain Maurice Suckling was the controller of the Navy. Nelson took his lieutenant's examination in Crutched Friars, just up from the Tower of London, where all of the vast majority of lieutenancy candidates went. And the idea of being a lieutenant is that A, you had to be 21 years of age, and B, you had to have 6 years experience with certificates to prove that that was the case. And he had to have the recommendation of his commanding officer. Well, 2 out of 3 isn't bad. He certainly had recommendations, and he certainly had the paperwork, but he was only 18 and a half years of age. However, when he arrived at the examination board, he discovered that the president of the board was a Captain Maurice Suckling, who happened to be there with 2 of his colleagues. And rumor has it, or legend says, that it wasn't until Nelson had successfully completed his board that he was the other 2 officers were informed that Suckling has in fact just examined his nephew. It was normal in those days to pick up your next ship or as a real lieutenant within about 6 months. And in fact, Nelson picked his one up the following day. And he became a 2nd lieutenant in Lowestoft, which was a frigate. And he spent the next 4 years on and off traveling out to the West Indies and serving in the West Indies. And on the West Indies station at the time, the commander-in-chief of the West Indies was a man called Admiral Sir Peter Parker. And Sir Peter Parker was a very, very prominent Freemason. In fact, in later life, he was to become Deputy Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of England. Not that Nelson knew him that well, not enough for Peter Parker to decide, oh, this is a likely dad, I think I'll put him up for the square. But it was certainly it was the first Mason that he met of any stature. While he was in the West Indies, he was very, very fortunate in boarding a ship, which 2 other lieutenants had signally failed to do. And as a result of that, he was appointed a 3rd lieutenant and then 1st lieutenant of HMS Bristol, which at the time was Peter Parker's flagship. He did so well at that he was very quickly promoted to be commander of a ship a brig called the Badger. And then in June 1979, he was made captain of the frigate Hinchinbrook. Now, in those days, if you were promoted to captain on a station, then you became eligible. If your posting was approved, you became eligible for, and the Admiralty decided you were good at that job or you could stay there. You then became what was known as a post captain. You've probably all heard of post captains. And once you're a post captain, the only thing apart from disease and enemy action and old age that's going to stop you becoming Admiral of the Fleet are the people in front of you on the list of post captains. So he was now on the ladder, and he was only 20 years of age when he was appointed captain of Hinchinbrook. Sadly, during his time there in Hinchinbrook in May 1780, he took an army expedition up the river Nicaragua to Fort Nicaragua in northern South America. And there he assisted the army in landing to attack the Spanish. But in so doing, he contracted a lung disease known as tropical sprue. Very, very debilitating. He was evacuated and taken to Port Royal in Jamaica, where a man called William Collingwood, realizing how dangerous it was for Nelson to be in the naval hospital there because of the possibility of being infected, decided to let him into his own house. And Nelson was put in his own house and to recover, which he partially did, following which he was appointed to HMS Janus in May 1980. But sadly, he was not well enough to fully take command of that ship. And in September 1780, he was sent back to England again to recuperate. And so by this time, it was almost becoming obvious to him that he was a bit surplus to requirements in terms of being a naval officer, because he was continually getting crook. He hadn't been well from day one. However, that's neither here nor there. But it was while in the West Indies, he was sent back home from there, as I say, and he then spent his time getting ready. He spent a year recuperating and stooging about London, and eventually he was sent in HMS Albemarle to the Baltic on convoy duties, and then to North America, where he met a man called Alexander Davison, who was the agent for the army in Canada. And he himself was also a very keen Freemason. He'd been initiated, past, and raised in Canada. And he was later, they became quite friendly, and he was later to become Nelson's prize agent, looking after Nelson's claims for prize money and generally spending his money when Nelson was away. So that was the second Mason that Nelson met. Coming back from in 83 from the Albemarle, he picked up in March 1784. He picked up the frigate Boreas and spent 3 years in her again in the West Indies, arriving back in this country in July 1787 to find that, horror of horrors, the war that had been raging against America, the American War of Independence, was now over. And therefore, a large number of officers were put ashore without ships, and Nelson happened to be one of those. And he spent the next 5 years ashore between the ages of 29 and 34. Now, I have to say, as most of you know, you're eligible to become a Freemason at the age of 21. But during the time that Nelson was at age 21 and more, he was in command of 3 ships in the West Indies, very busy at sea, and very, very unlikely to have been approached or even allowed to join. The other thing to bear in mind in the West Indies, he and Cuthbert Collingwood, who was a great friend of his and colleague, they insisted on enforcing the Navigation Acts. Navigation Acts were to ensure that the Americans could not sell things to the planters in our country, that country. The problem with that was, of course, if the planters couldn't buy goods and supplies from America because they were a rebel country and an enemy, you had to make other arrangements. And one of the arrangements they made was to try and replace the food that the slaves were being given with an alternative. And in order to find that alternative, a man called Captain Bligh, or Lieutenant Bligh, in HMS Bounty was sent to the Pacific to find some breadfruit. That's another story. Coming ashore in 87, as I said, 5 years later, 1983, the French Revolution broke out, 1783, and Nelson was called up and given command of HMS Agamemnon, a 64-gun ship serving in the Mediterranean. He then was transferred to HMS Captain, and in short order went to HMS. In short order, he was promoted to Commodore, and then carried his flag thereafter in various ships through the Mediterranean until he lost his arm at the Tenerife de la Santa Cruz in July 1797. Returning home, he spent 6 months convalescing and then was promoted to Rear Admiral and sent back to the Mediterranean under Admiral Jarvis, where he spent the next 2 years. He returned to this country in 1800, and hoping that that would give him respite and he'd be able to go ashore, because he by this time had made friends with Sir William Hamilton and had made Emma Hamilton his mistress, was not allowed to do so. And so he was sent during the home and Baltic campaigns. He was sent first of all to HMS San Joseph, which he captured at the Battle of St. Vincent, and then HMS St. George, from which ship he fought the Battle of Copenhagen. Having returned from Copenhagen in the Baltic, he was then sent, because there was a threat of invasion from Boulogne, he was then sent down to Deal, and he remained there until August 1801, when peace broke out yet again, and he was allowed to go ashore and have a private life again, until the Napoleonic Wars broke out in 1803, and he was sent then out to the Mediterranean as Commander-in-Chief, where he remained pretty well for the next 2.5 years, and obviously died there at Trafalgar. That's the brief story of Nelson's career. Now, was he a Freemason? Well, he certainly wasn't a Freemason in the West Indies, because he was too busy, and also he'd upset all the people in the West Indies who were Freemasons, because they were traders and planters, and he'd been against them in banning their use of America as a supply base. So that you can forget that for a start. So there is very little evidence anywhere that Nelson was a Mason, and none of it really comes through until after his death, which occurred on the 21st of October, 1805. As a result of his death at Trafalgar, there was a national outpouring of grief. His body was returned to this country because he specifically asked Hardy not to throw him overboard. And his body was returned to this country, laid in state in the Painted Hall at Greenwich during the first few days of January 1806, and eventually was taken to the Paul's Cathedral and buried in a state funeral on the 9th of January. Now, the point about this is that there are now reports that in December 1805, the Master of Union Lodge of York ordered that a banner be made in honor of Nelson to be carried in his funeral procession. And hello, we seem to have gone down. I'm seeing nothing here. Hello? Can anybody hear me?
Hi, Malcolm. Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, right. Well, I've got a blank screen here, but never mind. I'll press on. Yes, okay. So in December 1805, the Master of Union Lodge in York ordered a banner to be made to be carried in the funeral procession. There was a funeral procession for Nelson on the 9th of January, and there was also one, there must have been, in York, because the banner that was made in York certainly was not paraded in London. There's a very, very large document in the Maritime Museum, which shows the cortege of Nelson's funeral, which took 6 hours to pass a point, and there was nothing in there which mentioned banners being carried to do with masonry. Also, there was the Lodge of Friendship in Great Yarmouth had made a double cube of marble, which was inscribed to Lord Nelson in honor of the falling of our brother. And that is well known, and John Cutlove proposed it, and it was made, and it still exists in Friendship Lodge number 100. The point is, you must not accept the fact that because they mentioned Nelson as a brother, that he was a Mason. He certainly had never been to York, so it's unlikely that he would have been initiated in York. He's certainly been to Great Yarmouth because it was part of his home county. But again, there's no paperwork, there are no records to say that he joined. any of those lodges. And the whole idea, the fact that he was called a brother, you have to remember towards the end of the 19th century, there was a great feeling about liberty. The Americans had just had their independence war from 1776 to 83. The French had a revolution and chopped off their king's head. And there was a certain amount of feeling around the whole world that it was time that working men and men generally threw off their chains. So a number of friendly societies were formed, not all of them, I have to say, being very friendly. However, the mere fact that you called somebody brother in those days was really an act of friendship rather than to assume that they were brothers. I mean, after all, in the Battle of the Nile in August 1798, Nelson, who took his ships into Aboukir Bay, when the battle was over, his fellow captains, or his captains under his command, were referred to as the Band of Brothers. We are not to assume from that they were all Freemasons. So is it perfectly understandable, given the atmosphere of Nelson's death, because it was a huge outpouring of national mourning. And when you consider that there were the social media of the time was much reduced. It consisted of newspapers, and most newspapers at that time cost anything between 6pence and 10pence a copy. And the average man who's earning 3pence a day is not going to go out buying a daily newspaper, always assuming he could read, which he couldn't. So it had to be word of mouth, and it had to be reputation, and it had to be by feet. And that's how Nelson obviously became so popular, so well known. So that's the two things, the two bits of evidence that came up. Now, in 1998, a brother called Professor Brother John Webb wrote a monograph asking the question, was Nelson a Freemason? And all of these items that I've just mentioned were in there as being in all the evidence that there was that Nelson had been a Mason, which obviously is not the case, or it was not the case. You couldn't prove it from that. But then John Hamill, who at the time was the archivist in Grand Lodge, wrote an article in MQ in 2005, which was the bicentenary of Nelson's death. And he mentioned what I've already said about the banner and the block of marble. And he also mentioned the fact that there was a record that Nelson had attended a meeting in July 1787 at Plymouth. And he'd been invited to this meeting by Prince William Henry, who later was to become the Duke of Clarence and then King William IV, with whom Nelson had been serving, or who had been serving with Nelson in the West Indies. And one has to ask oneself, well, it's possible, because it was a stone laying ceremony that was in taking in place. And of course, in those days, Masonic stone laying ceremonies are very public events, and all the dignitaries and local luminaries were invited along, whether or not they were on the square. And Nelson is purported, well, someone signed the attendance register of Amphibious Lodge, number 407, as H. Nelson. So that apparently has been taken as gospel. There's a couple of things wrong with that argument, because in 1787, on the 5th of July, Nelson arrived back in Portsmouth, or in Spithead, actually, the anchorage of Portsmouth, from the West Indies in HMS Boreas. He arrived back and he was in bad odor with his superiors. He was in bad odor with the Secretary of the Admiralty and the Admiralty Board themselves, because during his time as in charge of his particular part of the Caribbean, he had rather overstepped the mark in terms of what he was entitled to. He'd also made a few promotions, which the Admiralty failed to confirm. And he also had supported Prince William, because Nelson was a bit of a sycophant. He supported Prince William in a dispute with Prince William's first lieutenant, And that wasn't sorted out for some years. But be that as it may, when Nelson arrived back in Portsmouth, instead of being paid off as he expected, he was told to remain in Spithead and be ready at short notice to go to sea. So he took on stores for 3 months because there was a possibility of an outbreak, a bigger outbreak from France. He stored for 3 months and he went to a number of courts martial while he was in Portsmouth. He sat on the board of courts martial. He also spent a great deal of time corresponding with Epion, who was the naval secretary at the time. Now, when we talk about the 15th of August, we know that Nelson was in Portsmouth on the 13th of August. And we know that he sailed from Portsmouth on the 15th of August, having dropped his ship down from Spithead to St. Helens Roads, which is just off Bembridge on the Isle of Wight, the day before. Now, to be in Plymouth on the 15th of August would have meant he would have to have left Portsmouth at least 2 days before, and it would take him, leaving on the 16th, it would take him at least 2 days to get back. There were two major ways you could get to Plymouth from Portsmouth. One was stagecoach, which is probably the route he took. And a stagecoach in those days traveled at 8 miles an hour, and they had coaching places where they changed the horses every 15 miles or so. And then when it came to night time, they pulled into the coaching inn and they stayed overnight and started off again the next morning. And so the distance from Plymouth to Portsmouth at that point was around about 120 miles. And because it would have meant going up to the main road towards Salisbury and then down the A303. It wasn't called the A303 then, but it's that road that goes down through Honiton and Exeter and eventually into Plymouth. That would have taken some time. The alternative to that would have been the post chaise, which is an extremely expensive method of travel. It was used by Lieutenant Laponetiere of HMS Pickle when he brought the news of Trafalgar back to this country in 1805. He arrived in Falmouth and he had to go to London with the news because that was his task. He actually left Falmouth, and he took him, it was 270 miles he had to cover from Falmouth to London, and the journey took him 37 hours, involved 21 changes of horses, and cost the Admiralty £46. Now, £46 is not to be sneezed at. That's one hell of a cab fare, because it actually equates to something like 3,500 in today's money. And Nelson never had that sort of money to squander on a trip to Plymouth. The other thing against him going as a guest of William Henry was that William Henry, in July 1987, was still serving as commanding officer of HMS Pegasus in the West Indies and didn't arrive back in this country until December 1787. Nelson did certainly go and visit him, but that was long after he'd paid off the Boreas, and it was in February 1788 when he went down there with his wife, Lady Nelson. So that's the other thing. The other thing that doesn't quite hang together is the final resting place, Boreas. The Irish blog mentions, and the myth is mentioned yet again, that the Boreas, when it did sail from Portsmouth on the 17th of July, went to decommissioned in Sheerness, and it states that Sheerness is in West Yorkshire. Now, the reason they ascribe to that, because they think that's important, is because Amphibious Lodge, which met in Plymouth, moved to Heckmondwike in West Yorkshire, which is where it now resides, and therefore they seem to think that if Nelson had gone round to pay off in Sheerness in West Yorkshire, he would have been near to where Amphibious Lodge was actually residing. The problem is, I don't know how many of you know, but I was born in Sheerness, and it happens to be on the Thames estuary, right opposite Southend, and about 8 miles downriver from Chatham, and 30 miles downriver from London. And the other thing against Sheerness being in West Yorkshire is West Yorkshire doesn't actually have very much of a coastline, on the basis that places like Lancashire and the Lake District get in between West Yorkshire and the sea. Now, if that's the only evidence, new evidence, to show that Nelson was a Mason, I would suggest that the Mr. Nelson who signed the visitor's book for Amphibious Lodge number 407 on the 15th of July, 1787, was not Horatio Nelson, but another Mr. H. Nelson. That's, in fact, if the signature is H. Nelson. You can see my pride. You can see the problem I have in believing all this so-called evidence. It doesn't hang together. I'm afraid that I have to quote a man called Martin Downey, whom, may I mention, John Hamill calls forward as a material witness in the fact that Nelson was a Freemason in his book, Martin Downey's book, Nelson's Purse. On page 177, with reference to Nelson's membership of a fraternity known as the Ancient Order of Gregorians, Downer writes, Nelson's elaborate regalia was sent to Fanny, that's Lady Nelson, but is now lost, leaving the letter that he, Nelson, wrote to William Gooch Ballance, the Grand Master of the Gregorians, on the 11th of March, 1801, as the only proof that he formerly belonged to a fraternal association. The bold is mine. Was Nelson a Freemason? I don't think so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. I'm sure everyone watching would agree that that was a fascinating insight into a man who I think we've obviously all heard of, but is probably quite misunderstood. And it's quite rare that we get beyond, you know, the statue in Trafalgar Square or kind of dig a bit deeper into the actually, you know, the kind of man that he actually was. So that was a fascinating talk, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Apologies, by the way, if some of you had some sound issues during that. There was a slight ticking noise that was going on throughout some of that, so apologies for that. But without further ado, we're going to move on to some questions, Malcolm. We've had a load of questions come through.
Okay.
As I
here I am. Look.
Yeah, he's back.
Yes, good Lord.
The man has returned. One thing I was going to say, actually, you were saying about the journey and how much it cost.
Yes.
£45. I mean, that's probably pretty average now, isn't it, for a single ticket on our railway? So
well, that's right. That's £46.
£46 then.
60 and 80 what it is today. In fact, it's probably a bit more now because of the inflation in the latter 20th century. But yeah, most of the figures one reads about the Georgian period, if you multiply by 60 to 80, you get it just about right.
Right. Okay. No, that's interesting. Right. So let's move on to some questions. We're going to do our best to get through all of them. If unfortunately we don't have time to get through to your questions, what I'll do is I'll make sure that I get those to Malcolm and we'll share those in some other way. But the first question we'll start off with, Malcolm, is what do you admire most about Nelson?
What I admire, his courage. Nelson had two sorts of courage, both sorts of courage, if you like. He had the courage to go at the enemy no matter what, and that was due to his hatred of the French because his mother hated the French. But he also had the cold courage to be able to walk around under fire in front of all his men and not even turn a hair. And that takes some jolly doing, especially as at heart he was a fatalist. And he honestly believed, and in fact, on his way back from the Far East in HMS Dolphin, he had a moment. He said it was well, we call it an epiphany today, but he had a moment of light, probably during one of his delirious breaks. And he said, he wrote in his book that his monograph he wrote later for the guidance of midshipmen, that he knew that he wasn't a very well man. He knew he didn't have a strong constitution, and he knew that probably he would die young. But in so doing, he would not flinch from his duty. And I think that is very, very sensitive, very good sentiment.
Absolutely. And another question here, Malcolm, which is actually quite fun. I've never actually heard this before, but is it true that Nelson suffered from seasickness?
Yes, indeed.
Wow,
He suffered
okay.
from seasickness very, very badly. And in fact, when he was in, I mean, if you go to sea and you feel queasy and what a mal de mer, after a few days you tend to get over it. But of course, if you get a nasty blow, it comes all the way back again. And yes, he did. He suffered from seasickness. He had heart problems. He had all sorts of, and he, when you consider, he left Emma Hamilton in Merton in 1803 and went to the Mediterranean and remained in Victory for the best part of 3 years. And because he promised her he wouldn't spend a night ashore, because she was an extremely jealous woman, he actually stayed in Victory for all of that time. And when they think the Mediterranean is rather nice, but if you get around the Gulf of Lion, it can be a little bit choppy.
God, yeah, that doesn't sound great. Actually, kind of linked to our first question about what you admired most about Lord Nelson. What do you think was Nelson's biggest failing?
Well, I mean, everyone's human, and Nelson was no exception. He treated his wife abominably over the relationship that he had with Lady Hamilton. And he was a very vain man. And he not very early, but sort of midway through his career, around about 1798, he really started to feel that he wasn't getting the recognition he thought he deserved. And he became very, very angry with his immediate superiors. In fact, he was not, I don't think he was very popular with his immediate peers, although he was extremely popular with his men because he was that sort of guy. But yes, everyone's human. Everyone has failings. And I think his biggest failure was vanity and a sincere, self-aggrandizement. When he felt he wasn't getting his way, he was happy. There we are.
Brilliant. Oh, that's interesting. Obviously, we know that at the time where Nelson was obviously alive and during his naval service, Freemasonry was popular, and it was certainly becoming a lot more popular. So, obviously, the presumption would be that he would have been aware of Freemasonry. Was it particularly popular in the Navy at the time? Could that have been another avenue in which that he would have discovered it?
Well, there are stories of certain ships, certain flagships, holding meetings on board. And there's a legend that Victory must have had Masonic meetings on board because the Admiral's cabin has got a black and white checkered floor. No, that's not true. Black and white checkered floors were sort of stylish in the Regency period and previous to that. And a lot of stately homes have got black and white checkered floors. So that's not the case. But yes, there were some lodges held on ships. And some of them were quite senior flags. Well, we know that Peter Parker was a senior Mason, and there would have been others, but I don't think there were many initiations on board ships. I think they would probably be ongoing meetings, rather like you get on cruise ships today. Personally, I don't think you'd have a ship's lodge.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Was Nelson viewed as a hero in his lifetime? Would he have been aware that he was seen as this kind of war?
Yes,
at the time as he is now?
His first major victory was, or first battle of which he took part successfully, was the Battle of St. Vincent in February 1797, when he captured the San Nicolas and the San Joseph. And that was under Jarvis, who became, as a result of that battle, Lord St. Vincent. He then went on and fought the Battle of the Nile, which made him extremely popular with everyone in Italy and Austria and all the monarchies of Europe, because it proved that Napoleon could actually be thrashed. And in fact, it was a double blow to Napoleon, because his invading army that was stuck in Egypt for a long, long time before they could get them out again. And then that was the start of his popularity, really. But Copenhagen was another one. Copenhagen was strange. He considered his best battle. We fought the Danes in Copenhagen in April 1801. The government didn't recognise it as an important issue, although it did achieve the point that they required. But it was on the back of that, really. Niall and Copenhagen were the two actions which brought him to the public attention. And as I've said before, there were no social media, you know. But when he departed in September 1805 to go to Victory to smash the French and Spanish, he was mobbed, and he was mobbed often in London during 1801 and 1802. They recognised him for what he was, and he was mobbed. He was really, they all wanted to be part of him, and he really was a popular figure.
It's almost like a kind of 18th century Elvis Presley type situation, I'm imagining.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, it would be someone like a footballer today, or maybe even, you know. But certainly he was extremely the common people and the men on his lower deck had a great deal more regard for him than most of the aristocracy and the big noises, because of what he'd done with William Hamilton and Emma mainly. Yeah.
Okay. PG rated question, this one. Not one for the squeamish. Was it true that Nelson's arm was amputated at the Battle of Santa Cruz de Tenerife without anesthetic?
Yeah, yes, it is, because he didn't drink a lot of fluids. He didn't drink rum. He had the occasional glass of wine, but no, he bit on a piece of leather, and they sawed it off for him. And in fact, in so doing, when the surgeon, because he was in a hurry to do it because of the pain, when he sewed his arm up, the ligature caught a nerve in the stump, which gave Nelson jip for ages and ages. And he was repatriated in August 1797. And it was in December, one morning when Lady Fanny was dressing his wound, the ligature fell away and he had immediate relief from pain. And it was that which prompted him to go back to sea. Although he had written to St. Vincent saying, you wouldn't want a left-handed, one-eyed admiral. And they said, well, actually, get better and we'll see what we can do.
Fantastic. And is it true, Malcolm, that someone asked that if Nelson was given an order that he didn't want to comply with, after he'd lost his eye, he would hold up his telescope to the
that apparently happened at the Battle of Copenhagen.
Right.
The story is that Hyde Parker, who was no relation to Peter Parker, was laying off in his flagship, and Nelson had gone in with his 10 ships to bombard Copenhagen, and it was going rather badly. There was a lot of steel and iron flying about, and in fact, when you consider it, to think of a number of ships going into a well-established shore establishment with endless supplies of manpower and supplies, you wouldn't think that ships could win it, but in fact he did. It was about, the battle started at about 10, and about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Hyde Parker saw the way it was going and flew the signal to withdraw. And Nelson was told by his flag lieutenant that signal was flying, and he realized that if he did at that stage order his fleet away from the enemy, then in turning away, they would be subject to a murderous fire. And so he asked his flag lieutenant which signal he was flying, and he was told it was code 39, my lord, you know, keep engaging any more closely. He said, keep it there. And he did. And strangely enough, I talked about Captain Bligh earlier. Captain Bligh was present at Copenhagen, one ship astern of Nelson in HMS Elephant. And he was in HMS Glatton, which was totally armed with carronades, brilliant crushing guns, but they got no range. So he had to get very close. And when he saw both Hyde Park's signal and he saw Nelson's signal, and he kept his flag 39 flying as well. So he underlined what Nelson was doing, and they carried on and, of course, got a victory. Captain Roux in HMS Amazon, a frigate captain to the north of the line, saw Hyde Parker's signal, couldn't see through the smoke at Nelson's ship, so he obeyed Hyde Parker's signal and was cut in half as his ship turned away. And very severely damaged, the ship was too.
Right, thank you for that, Malcolm. An interesting question here from Matty. Do you think, knowing much of what you do about Lord Nelson, that he would have made a great Freemason if he had have been one in his era?
It's difficult to say, because great men who become Freemasons either don't have the time to give to Freemasonry, and I'm thinking now about Winston Churchill, for example, or well, they just or when they could do it when they've retired, but of course that makes them very old. Nelson, had he survived Trafalgar, Nelson would have come back. He would have been 47 years of age and pretty old. It's possible that he would have got reasonably early advancement in Freemasonry had he joined a London lodge because of who he was. But yeah, I don't know. It's one of those questions you just can't answer.
Sure. An interesting question here. Did Lord Nelson and the Duke of Wellington, who we know was a Freemason, did they ever meet?
Yes, they did. They met once in the War Office at Whitehall, and it was a very brief meeting. And Wellington was in the office waiting to see some military guy, and Nelson came in on an errand to see the Secretary of the Admiralty. And Wellington said afterwards that on first meeting this diminutive man, he seemed a bit silly and what have you, and a bit difficult to communicate. And then Nelson walked out of the room, and he was away for about 3 minutes, and he came back in, and Wellington said, I was then engaged in one of the most serious conversations about tactics and strategy. He said, and it completely changed my view of him. But that was the only time they did meet.
I think that would be an interesting conversation to have heard, I'm sure.
Yes.
A question here, quite an interesting one, actually, and intriguing. I've never heard this before. Is it true that Nelson once fought off a polar bear as a midshipman?
Well, it was when he was in HMS Carcass in the Arctic Circle, and they'd been trying to, the crew had been out shooting bears because they needed to meet. And one very early one morning, Captain Lutwidge went on deck, and he saw at a great distance two figures on the ice, one of whom was Nelson, who was then at that time 15 years of age or so, who was armed with a gun, armed with a musket or rifle or something. And they made a signal for them to return to the ship. But between the ship and Nelson, there was a polar bear. And Nelson took aim at this polar bear and pulled the trigger, and well, lo and behold, quick as a flash, nothing happened. So they discharged a gun from the Carcass, HMS Carcass, which scared the bear off, and then Nelson came back on board. But yes, I mean, he was willing, when the gun misfired, he was willing to pick it up by the barrel. He was going to give the bear a smack round the head with the butt, which fortunately he didn't get that far. Otherwise, the story would have ended there, I think.
I think it probably were not the best idea if you're going to get in a fight with a polar bear. Interesting question here about Nelson's legacy. What do you think, looking back, we're obviously in 2020 now, completely different times, what do you think is Nelson's legacy?
Well, it's got to be his undoubted courage, his on-the-spot strategy and tactics. Now, there were times when he made mistakes. He was injured a number of times in his life. He lost his eye in Sardinia in 1794. He lost his arm in 1797. He got very, very ill in Hitchingbrook earlier on when he was in the West Indies. And it seems that every time he attempted a combined operation with land and sea forces, it didn't quite come off for him. But when he was involved in a sea operation, he was unbeatable. And I mean, the number of times that he took his ship when he was out in the Mediterranean in Albemarle and took his ship to action stations, which is clear for action, and everything goes over the side, and they take the bulkheads down and everything. He did that 105 times in 3 years. I suppose the ship's carpenter was a bit fed up with making bulkheads and had to go ashore and fell trees and stuff. No, he was a tactician, and he was a strategist, and because of his courage and because the people believed in him, That's the other thing. Because they did believe in him, they followed him, and he invariably brought them through. Well, the other combined operation he failed miserably at was at Boulogne in 1802. But he didn't lead that one, and he lost 600 killed and wounded there. And that's when he swore he would never, ever again send men into action. He would always lead them.
Thank you. Yeah, I read somewhere that he was always 100% confident that he was going to win. It was just the manner of the victory that was more important to him, and the glory that he could take on the back of it that was.
That's right.
So this is actually a fascinating question. I've never heard this one before either. I read somewhere on the internet that the French sniper that shot Nelson at Trafalgar was a Freemason. Do you know if this was true?
I've heard the rumor too. I don't know. I don't know. I've certainly read the story, but I don't know whether we can ratify it, because the records would have to be searched, and it's hard enough finding English masonry records of that date, let alone going into French ones, when you bear in mind that there was a revolution, or there had been a revolution, and a certain amount of stuff was thrown away.
Yeah, no, that would be difficult.
Yes.
A message here, Bravo Zulu Malcolm from an ex-submariner.
Oh, right. Okay.
Do you think Nelson would fit in today's Navy as a leader?
That's very difficult to answer. And the reason I say that is because when Nelson was in command, he was in command because he couldn't get into an action and ask Whitehall or Northwood whether it would be a good idea to attack, which is what you have to do these days. It's all in instant communication. So I don't think he'd be too happy with that. He was much happier when he was in charge, when he was saying, yeah, let's go, we're going to do this, attack those ships, chase those ships. But if he had to ask permission every time, and given the fact that probably half the time the rules of engagement would have changed and he wouldn't be allowed to do it, he would probably get very, very uppity. So no, I'm not entirely sure he would fit into the modern fighting units.
Right. So this is I think a famous belief about Nelson. He's obviously lying in the in HMS Victory. He's been shot. He's mortally injured, and he's being updated regularly about the state of the battle.
Yes.
You know, yes. I'm about to ask Malcolm. As
yes.
he moved closer to death, did he really look up and say, "Kiss me, Hardy"?
Yes. I have no doubt at all about that. Let me give you a bit of background. He lost his mother when he was 8. He went to sea when he was 12. The idea of affection as a youngster he was starved of it. But a lot of people, I mean, you get this band of brothers thing again. I mean, we all talk about it now when you bond. And if you've been in the warship for 2.5 years with 800 other men, you tend to bond a bit. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily means they're homosexual, but it means they've got a bond together. And he wanted, at the moment, in extremis, at the moment of his death, he wanted comfort. And I'm entirely sure that's what he did, because Hardy kissed him and was about to leave when he went back and kissed him again. And Nelson said, "Who was that?" And he said, "That's Hardy, my lord." He said, "God bless you, Hardy." So he kissed him twice, in fact.
Right, okay. Was it true that Lord Nelson's body was brought back to England in a barrel of brandy, and that this brandy was later sold as a souvenir?
No. He was placed in brandy immediately after the battle, and he was then taken into Gibraltar. They arrived there some 5 days later because of a heavy storm, and he was taken up. The body was taken up in a coffin to Rosier Bay in Gibraltar, which is just to the south and up the hill from South Mole. And he was then put in a casket containing spirit of wine, which is ethanol or alcoholic or medical alcohol. And it's in that he was transported back to this country. They went into Portsmouth, first of all, in early December 1805. and then they got rid of their wounded and all the bit, did some repairs, and then they sailed around from Portsmouth to Sheerness, and en route from Portsmouth to Sheerness, Surgeon Beatty, who was the ship's surgeon, performed the autopsy on Nelson. They arrived off the Nore, which is as I sit here now, it's 1.5 miles in that direction. They arrived off the Nore, and his body was then transferred into a coffin which had been given to him by Captain Hallowell, who'd been one of his captains at the Battle of the Nile. And the coffin was actually made from the mainmast of the French ship L'Orient. He was transferred to that. First of all, he put a leg line coffin, then transferred to that, carted up to Greenwich, where he arrived on the 22nd of December, I think it was. Or yes, and then Christmas Eve, that he was taken into the Painted Hall. And after Christmas, for some days, he lay in state so that people would go into the Painted Hall at Greenwich and pay their respects. And on the 9th of January, 1806, the body was taken up to St. Paul's Cathedral and interred. So, yes, but it wasn't brandy, and they didn't sell it off. And Royal Marines did not go around drinking it and call it Nelson's blood. So all those stories are very nice, but they're not necessarily true.
No. Talking of, I guess, after Nelson's death, do you know whether or not the band of brothers that fought alongside Nelson stayed in touch? Did they get together again after his death? Is there any historical records of that?
Well, of course, it's very difficult because they were captains of ships. Some were promoted to flag rank. Troubridge, who was one of his captains at Trafalgar in the Culloden, which was unable to, she went aground at Aboukir Bay, and so she couldn't make it in there. Nelson insisted that Troubridge got a medal. Troubridge became First Sea Lord, or First Lord of the Admiralty, while Nelson was serving in the Mediterranean. And some chill crept into their relationship because Troubridge was in a position to tell Nelson what to do and where to go on behalf of their lordships. And as I said, in modern day parlance, that would be an order. And everybody these days, they say it indeed. But Nelson didn't like it. But yeah, they went their own ways to a great extent. If they ever did meet, then it was obviously a very good excuse for a bit of a party.
Absolutely. I think we've probably got time for maybe three more questions before we close. Nelson took a commission as a Marine officer. Freemason was popular with the Marines. Is there any evidence that he could have joined a Marine lodge?
None at all. None at all. Yes, he did. He did get a commission as a Marine officer because the way it worked was it was part of being a flag officer, and it also added a couple of quid to his pay packet. And he was, you know, but it was that was really in a gift. It was a thing you were given because of where you were and what you were doing. But no, there's no evidence that he joined a Marine Lodge, a Royal Marine Lodge, I should say. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right. Okay. Did Lord Nelson ever serve with Admiral Thomas Cochrane?
No.
No.
No, they were. Cochrane was a very, very good admiral, and he was on a par to a great extent with Nelson, but he was doing most of what he did for foreign navies because he couldn't get a job in the Royal Navy, so he wanted to go away and become a mercenary, effectively. But yeah, Cochrane was very good.
We were spoiled for choice. Right. So penultimate question. Am I right in remembering that Nelson lies in a tomb that was originally constructed for Cardinal Wolsey, who was, of course, Henry VIII's chief advisor before he kicked him out?
Yes. It was Wolsey's sarcophagus, which they used for Nelson's tomb.
Right. Okay. No, that's interesting. And you can still are you able to go and view that still?
Yes, it's in the crypt at St. Paul's.
Fantastic. Okay, so to end, obviously, again, Malcolm, I just want to thank you. We'll finish on one final question. Obviously, the famous monument to Nelson is in Trafalgar Square on Nelson's column. But is this the only monument to Nelson? And isn't it true that, in fact, prior to the construction of Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square, there was plans for a much bigger monument down in Greenwich?
That's possibly true. There are other monuments. There's a big one in Great Yarmouth. There's one in Monmouthshire, in Monmouth itself, because that is where Sir William Hamilton had lands. And there's a very, very good Nelson Museum in Monmouth. And they creep up all over the place. They're little statues here, there, and everywhere. But as to the Greenwich one, I think that was considered, but dismissed because it was too far from the centre of London. And they really wanted, you know, if it's going to be worthwhile, this is our naval hero, we'll smack him right in the middle so that you can see him when you go to work.
Yeah, doesn't get much more central than that, I guess, does it?
No.
Right. So, on behalf of all of us at UGLE, Malcolm, I'd just like to thank you for your time this evening. I'm sure our attendees would agree with me that that was a fascinating insight into, as I say, probably quite a misunderstood figure in our history, but someone who obviously gave his life in service to his country, and was obviously responsible for a number of crucial victories against the French and Napoleon, and in a lot of ways stopped Napoleon's advances into, as we discussed, into India and obviously Egypt as well, and into Africa, etc. So I'd put on our records, Malcolm, thank you very much for your time. To those attending, I just want to say thank you for everyone for coming along this evening. We hope that you enjoyed the talk. The talk will also be available on demand in a link that we'll be posting on social media after this presentation has finished. And then the link will also be available in the next edition of The First Rising. I would like to also end by saying that if you are listening to this and you think that you have an interesting topic for a talk, do get in touch with us. You can find the contact details for us on the UGLE website, and we will be more than happy to discuss your topic or your chosen topic or something that you think is warranting of a official UGLE lecture. So again, thank you very much for coming. We hope you found it enjoyable, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Good night, everybody.
Good night from him.